so I'm going to be discussing some anti-vaccine arguments and providing some counter-arguments to prove those anti-vaccine arguments false and validate these counter-arguments. So to start out with, one anti-vaccine argument that is pretty talked about a lot is vaccines contain many toxic chemicals that aren't safe at any dosage, and chemicals that these anti-vaccine lobbyists like to talk about being harmful are formaldehyde, aluminum, and mercury. Well, to start off with, a point I'd like to make is that lots of things are toxic at high enough levels, but safe at low enough levels. And the levels that these chemicals are being used in vaccines are extremely, extremely low. And further, this anti-vaccine argument ignores the fact that our bodies are made of these so-called toxic chemicals I want to talk about. And even the organic grown fruit that we eat is in these chemicals. Or this organic fruit that we eat contains these toxic chemicals. So let's talk about formaldehyde. Well, the anti-vaccine lobbyists like to point out that formaldehyde is known to be extremely carcinogenic. But what they're failing to point out is that our bodies actually require a small amount of formaldehyde. And another thing I want to point out is that pears, they actually have way more formaldehyde than the formaldehyde found in vaccines. So in a pear, we actually have 12,000 micrograms of formaldehyde. But in a vaccine, this is what it's showing, you actually have 0.83% formaldehyde in that vaccine compared to a pear. So it's all about the amount. And clearly, we're not worried about eating pears, which are found to not be harmful. So we should not be worried about the harmful effects of formaldehyde in vaccines because it's in such a low amount, especially compared to that pear. And the next chemical that they like to say is harmful is aluminum. Well, is aluminum toxic? Yeah. Is it in vaccines? Yes, it is. But another thing it's in that people don't complain about is breast milk that mothers give to their young. So actually, during the first 6 months of an infant's life, on a regular vaccine schedule, an infant will actually get roughly 4 milligrams of aluminum from vaccines. And compared to a mother's breast milk, the aluminum vaccines is in an extremely low amount. During those same 6 months, this infant is actually going to get roughly 10 milligrams from breast milk or 40 milligrams from baby formula. So no matter what you do, if you plan on feeding your child in those first 6 months of life, they're actually going to receive much more aluminum from breast milk than they're ever going to see from aluminum in vaccine, and that's clearly not harmful at all. The third chemical people really like to point out, and it scares people, is mercury. But the funny thing is that vaccines actually don't contain just mercury. They contain thimerosal, which is a mercury-containing preservative. So what these anti-vaccine people like to say is if vaccines contain thimerosal and thimerosal contains mercury, then therefore vaccines contain mercury. Well, let's talk about what thimerosal is. Thimerosal is actually ethyl mercury, and the toxic mercury is methyl mercury. So a major concept of chemistry is that how chemicals behave depends on the chemicals that they are bound to. So when that mercury is bound to methyl, yes, it's highly toxic. If that mercury is bound to ethyl, then it is not toxic unless it's used in extremely, extremely high doses. And the ethyl mercury is what we are going to find in our vaccines. And so it's not harmful, but another illustration to use about how chemicals will change their properties based on what they other chemicals they are bound to. So if we have sodium and chlorine, both by themselves are highly toxic. And if you sprinkle either one of these just by themselves on your food, not going to be good. But when you combine sodium and chloride together, it changes the properties of the individual elements alone, and that becomes table salt, which we use all the time, and that's not poisonous. So it's just like combining mercury and ethyl. When you have ethyl mercury, it becomes not poisonous or not toxic to us, and it's also used in such low amounts in this vaccines it's not harmful. So another way I want to point this out is ethyl versus methyl when we're talking about alcohols. Methyl alcohol can kill you. It's extremely, extremely deadly. Ethyl alcohol, people drink in vodka. And of course, in extremely high dosages, you're going to get alcohol poisoning and die. But if you have a small dosage, just like comparing the small dosage of ethyl mercury we get in our vaccines, then it's not going to be harmful. And that's just a way of showing how chemicals will react differently based on the different substances that they're bound to, and how you can't just broadly categorize mercury as being harmful the same way you can't broadly categorize alcohol as being harmful. And another thing, going back to aluminum, I wanted to show you is that pure aluminum, yes, is highly toxic, but that aluminum that is found in vaccines actually comes in the form of aluminum salt, aluminum hydroxide and aluminum phosphate, and that's going to change the properties and the toxicity of that aluminum and make it safe for us to use in our vaccines. So that's disproving the whole harmful chemicals and their toxic nature argument. Another argument that anti-vaccine lobbyists like to make is that no vaccine is 100% safe. Well, yes, but you know what else isn't safe is 100% if not getting vaccinated. They love to list the potential side effects of vaccines that can come when taking a vaccine, but anti-vaccine lobbyists like to completely ignore the extremely dangerous, far more dangerous side effects of not getting vaccinated. And this is what we've seen in history's past, such as measles, polio, hepatitis, eventual death. And those were the harmful, dangerous side effects we saw in our history's past when people weren't vaccinated, and compared to in today's times when people are getting vaccinated, it's much safer. And while it's 100%, we can't guarantee there will be no side effects. It's nothing in comparison to what it could be without vaccination. Another argument anti-vaccine lobbyists like to make is if vaccines work, then why does my child have to get vaccinated, since technically they should already be protected because everyone else should be disease-free because they have the vaccine. Therefore, it wouldn't matter if my child was vaccinated. Well, this goes to explaining something called herd immunity. So, when a large number of individuals are vaccinated, very few people get exposed to a large dose of the disease. And therefore very few people get it. This is the concept of herd immunity, which protects the population as a whole, and what makes those vaccines actually useful. But when people start choosing to not get vaccinated, when there are unvaccinated people around, you're much more likely to get a large dose of disease and actually get sick. And there are actually many elderly people and immunocompromised people who cannot receive the vaccine, but they're protected by this herd immunity concept. So if you choose to not get the vaccine, then you're actually putting other people at risk, and that could eventually put yourself at risk. And so I want to show you, the red is a person who has the disease and can potentially infect others, and a red arrow symbolizes the spread of disease. So no herd immunity, we're going to have the gray dots symbolize unvaccinated people. And you're going to see with no herd immunity, there's a greater number of unvaccinated people as opposed to over here with herd immunity. Well, when this infected person comes into contact, because these people chose not to get vaccinated, it's going to spread to those people. And what you're going to see is this disease is going to start to spread like wildfire to all these people, these gray dots who chose not to get vaccinated. Well, you're going to see, yeah, these vaccinated people are protected. But in herd immunity, that idea that a majority of the population, way more blue dots, fewer gray dots, perhaps these gray dots couldn't get vaccinated, they were elderly, immunodeficiency, it's going to protect that population as a whole, because we're going to see that this infectious disease is going to be stopped from spreading like wildfire because it's going to come in contact with a vaccinated person. And so then the disease can't spread. Or it's going to spread to an unvaccinated person, but then it can't spread even further because they're going to come into contact with vaccinated people. So you can't throw off herd immunity, and that's what happens when people choose not to get vaccinated. So in short, vaccines work and reduce disease even if you don't vaccinate, but they work much more effectively when everyone is vaccinated. Another argument people like to make is vaccines cause autism. And the counter argument for this was just a completely false article that was proposed back in 1998 by Dr. Wakefield, and he suggested that vaccines were causing autism. There's actually a whole big court order about it, lawsuit, and he was found to be lying, and he had to retract his paper. But a further point to point out of how this is not correct is that thimerosal, that ethyl mercury we talked about earlier, was generally the chemical that was blamed in the vaccines for causing autism. But actually, they took that chemical, the thimerosal, out of vaccines back in 2001. So it's no longer being used, so that's no longer of concern, but we've still seen autism rates dramatically increase throughout the years. So you just can't link autism with the vaccines, especially since we got rid of what they thought to be the causative agent back in 2001. Another argument people like to make is that vaccines can overwhelm the child's immune system. So the argument for this is that you're giving tons of vaccines to newborns, and newborns' immune systems aren't fully formed. Well, you have to compare this to these vaccines given to your newborn are exposing your child to a very small number of antigens, which eventually the small exposure to antigen are going to help them build up antibodies that in the future, subsequent exposure, they're going to be able to fight that disease better and quicker. But when we're comparing the small number of antigen that the vaccine exposes to your child, it is so much smaller in comparison to just the number of antigen and harmful agents that your child's exposed to just in the few hours after they were born. So basically, unless you have a C-section in a clean room and instantly stick your child into an incubation chamber, it's going to be exposed to far many more antigens in those first few hours after birth than it will ever be exposed to and getting from vaccines. And so arguing that vaccines are going to overwhelm a child's immune system is kind of like arguing that a very small teaspoon of water is going to overflow an Olympic swimming pool. It just doesn't make sense, comparison-wise. The final anti-vaccine argument that people like to make that I would like to discuss is that every year the CDC has come out with, which is the Centers for Disease Control, has come out with a report that 30,000 people report their children getting sick after being vaccinated. I kind of hit on this earlier, but yes, that is true. 85 to 90% of those reports are what the CDC called mild adverse effects. So this can include fever, crying, mild irritability, and just local reactions. But we have to think about is that these mild side effects aren't anywhere close to the life-threatening events that could be happening if we chose not to get vaccinated. And we've just seen that from history's past, the spread that can happen, or the polio, the influenza, back when we didn't have the vaccination for it. So you gotta see how the good's gonna outweigh the bad here. Those small, mild adverse effects, in hindsight, are going to be much less harmful and dangerous as if we chose to not get vaccinated. And so that's just a few arguments people like to make against the idea, but in hindsight, vaccines have led to the control and elimination of many infectious diseases that at one time claimed millions of lives. And the good's far outweighing the bad, and all these arguments that we should definitely get vaccinated. And that's all. Feel free to use my video. Thanks.